"This marriage is just for show," said the cowboy, yet his heart told another story. The wind howled through the trees on the edge of the forest, carrying with it the cold bite of early evening. In a small, broken-down cabin, Clara sat huddled in a corner, her hands trembling, but her eyes still fierce. She was young, with hair the color of ripe wheat and eyes that reflected both fear and defiance. For days she had been trapped here, far from the safety of her home, surrounded by people who meant her harm. They called themselves a gang, but to Clara, they were nothing more than cruel strangers who had stolen her freedom. Every day had been the same: harsh words, cold food, and the constant reminder that she had no one to protect her. Yet Clara refused to give in. Every time the gang members tried to break her spirit, she met them with defiance. "I'd rather die than bow to you," she would say, her voice trembling but firm. They laughed at her words, but there was a strength in her eyes they could not ignore. Deep down, she knew she could not last long like this if no one came to help. But she also refused to surrender her dignity. The cabin itself was almost as cruel as her captors. Its walls were weak and crooked, letting in the wind and the strange sounds of the forest at night. The floorboards creaked under every step, and the small fireplace hardly gave any warmth. Clara spent hours staring out the narrow windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone, anyone, who might be coming to save her. But all she could see were the trees swaying and the shadows growing longer as the sun disappeared. The forest, which was beautiful in the daylight, seemed to close in around her at night, making her feel even more trapped. Her captors were young men, rough and impatient. They were used to scaring people into obedience, but Clara's resistance frustrated them. They tried threats and intimidation, warning her that no one would come to help. Some of them laughed cruelly, others grew angry, pacing the cabin while she sat quietly. But she never let them see her fear completely. Sometimes she whispered to herself, reciting small memories of home: the warm kitchen, her mother's laughter, the smell of fresh bread. These thoughts were her shield, her small escape from the harsh reality around her. Clara's mind was constantly racing, thinking of ways to get out, ways to survive. She watched the gang carefully, noticing their habits, the moments when they were careless or distracted. She learned which ones were more easily fooled, and which were the most dangerous. Every detail mattered, even though she had no weapons, no one to fight for her. She knew that her greatest strength was her mind. She planned even if she had no immediate way to act on those plans. Sometimes, in the stillness of the cabin, she let herself imagine running through the forest, feeling the cool air on her face, free from the walls that held her prisoner. At night, when the gang members fell asleep, Clara would sometimes lie awake on the hard floor, listening to the soft breathing of her captors mixed with the rustling of the wind outside. The forest seemed alive with whispers, as if the trees themselves were speaking to her. In those quiet hours, fear tried to creep in, but she forced herself to remember her own strength. She thought about her family and friends, and the life she hoped to return to. She imagined the look on her captors' faces, if she ever escaped. These thoughts gave her courage, a small fire that refused to die despite the cold and darkness. Clara's defiance was not just for herself. It was also a challenge to her captors. They could take her freedom, threaten her, and even frighten her, but they could not take her will. Every time they demanded submission, she refused, and every refusal made her feel a little stronger. She realized that surrendering would only make them stronger, and she would lose herself completely. Even in the face of fear, she held on to her spirit, knowing that survival meant more than just escaping the cabin. It meant keeping her sense of self intact. The gang was growing impatient. They wanted results, and Clara's resistance annoyed them. They argued among themselves, sometimes raising voices and threatening one another. Clara listened closely, gathering every piece of information she could. She learned their plans, their weaknesses, and their fears. Even though she was trapped, she began to feel that she had some control. Her mind became sharper, her senses more alert. The walls of the cabin no longer felt like absolute prison walls. They were now a place to watch, to plan, and to wait for the right moment. One day, a young gang member came into the cabin with food. He was less experienced than the others, and Clara noticed how nervous he seemed. "Here," he said, tossing a small loaf of bread toward her. "Eat." She looked at him carefully, noticing the hesitation in his eyes. This was her chance. She asked simple questions, casually, trying to learn more about the gang's routines. He stumbled over his answers, unaware that she was reading him like a book. Every small detail mattered: where they went, what they carried, when they were distracted. Even these tiny observations gave her hope. Clara's hope was fragile, but it persisted. She refused to give up, even when the nights were long and the wind cut through the cabin walls. She whispered stories to herself, imagining a world outside where she could breathe freely, walk without fear, and live without the constant shadow of danger. In her mind, she ran through open fields, under the bright sun, and felt the earth solid beneath her feet. These daydreams were more than fantasies. They were reminders that life still existed beyond these walls, and that one day she would return to it. Despite the danger, Clara never lost her courage. Every moment of fear became a test, and every test made her more determined. She began to understand that survival was not only about escaping physically, but also about staying strong mentally. Her defiance was her armor, and it protected her as much as any lock or chain could. She clung to it fiercely, knowing that it was her spirit that would carry her through whatever came next. Days passed slowly, each one blending into the next. Clara measured time not by hours or minutes, but by small victories, surviving another day, learning another detail about the gang, or simply holding on to hope. And even though the world outside the cabin seemed far away and unreachable, she never stopped believing that someone would come, that help would arrive, and that her story was not yet finished. She was determined to live, to fight, and to reclaim her freedom, no matter how impossible it seemed. And so Clara waited, refusing to break, refusing to surrender. Her mind stayed sharp, her courage unyielding. The cabin that once seemed like a prison became a place of silent strategy, a stage for resilience and hope. For in the darkness of captivity, Clara discovered the strength that would one day lead her back to freedom, a strength no one could take away, and a determination that no threat could extinguish. The sun rose over the dusty plains, painting the horizon in soft oranges and golds. Birds chirped in the distance, and the faint sound of a river flowing could be heard far off. In a small frontier town, life went on quietly, though beneath the calm surface, whispers of danger stirred among the people. Stories had begun circulating about a young woman who had vanished from her home, taken by a ruthless gang that no one dared to challenge. Some townsfolk shook their heads in fear, others whispered in hushed tones, and a few brave men talked of rescue, but none acted. Fear had frozen them. It was at this time that Jack appeared. He was a lone cowboy known in the region for his sharp mind, quick decisions, and unusual ways of solving problems. Unlike other men in town, he didn't rely solely on guns or brute force. Jack had a reputation for seeing opportunities where others saw only danger. His horse, a large chestnut with white markings on its face, carried him smoothly through the town streets as people paused to watch him ride. He didn't talk much, and his eyes held a quiet intensity, as though he was always calculating, always planning his next move. Jack had heard about Clara's disappearance the day before, in the general store, where a few townsfolk were debating what should be done. Some said the gang would take what they wanted and move on. Others claimed no one could stop them. Jack listened carefully to each word, noting details that others considered irrelevant. Who had last seen the woman? Which direction had the gang taken? What weaknesses had been mentioned? By the time the conversation ended, he had pieced together enough information to make a plan. While others were paralyzed by fear, Jack felt a sense of purpose. He knew that sometimes courage and cleverness were stronger than weapons. By mid-morning, he set out toward the forest, following the faint trails that led away from town. His eyes scanned the surroundings constantly. Every broken branch, every bent blade of grass, every footprint in the dust told a story. Jack had learned to read the land like a book. Nothing escaped his notice. He moved quietly, as though the forest itself were guiding him. The air smelled of pine and earth, and the distant sound of a bird taking flight made him pause to listen. He was careful not to rush, knowing that patience often gave him the advantage over those who relied only on strength. After hours of tracking, Jack spotted the cabin. It was small and broken down, almost hidden by the thick trees surrounding it. Smoke curled faintly from a crooked chimney, suggesting that someone was inside. He crouched behind a large oak and observed. Through the cabin window he could see shadows moving, hear raised voices, and sense the tension in the air. The gang members were careless, arguing among themselves while keeping a watchful eye on their prisoner. Jack noticed their weaknesses immediately. One of them seemed easily frustrated, another distracted, and the smallest member appeared nervous, not fully committed to their crime. These small details were important. Jack spent hours observing, learning the routines of the gang. He noted when they left the cabin, when they brought in food, and when they argued. Each moment of carelessness was a potential opportunity. He thought about the young woman inside and imagined her courage. Even from a distance, he could see the defiance in her posture, the way she held her head high despite fear. It reminded him why he had come. Clara's spirit had not broken, and he knew that if he could use his wits, he could bring her home safely. As the sun dipped low, Jack made his move. He rode closer to the cabin, keeping to the shadows, and dismounted silently. The forest floor was soft with fallen leaves, which muffled his steps. He approached the cabin with caution, knowing that one wrong move could alert the gang. When he reached the window, he peered inside and saw Clara. Her eyes were wide with surprise at seeing someone outside, someone who might finally be her savior. Jack didn't speak immediately. Instead, he assessed the situation carefully. He watched how the gang interacted with one another, noting their strengths, their weaknesses, and the tension that hung between them. Jack's plan was simple but risky. He would confront the gang, not with threats or violence, but with strategy. He had learned that people who relied only on fear or money could be outsmarted. He waited until the largest member of the gang stepped outside, leaving only the smaller, less confident men inside. Then he approached boldly, his calm demeanor surprising them. "I'm here for the girl," he said, his voice steady, neither loud nor threatening. The men laughed at him, mocking his courage, but Jack remained unshaken. "What makes you think you can take her?" One of the gang sneered. "You're just one man. We have guns, knives, and numbers on our side." Jack looked at them steadily, not a hint of fear in his eyes. He weighed his words carefully. "I don't need more than what I have," he said, his voice calm. Sometimes cleverness and courage are worth more than weapons or strength. The gang hesitated, unsure of what he meant, giving Jack the moment he needed to think ahead. He continued, subtly planting doubt and curiosity. "You want money?" he said. I have only $3. That's all I can offer. The gang roared with laughter. $3? They had expected a large ransom. The idea seemed ridiculous. Jack stayed calm, however, and let the silence speak. He had no illusions about how fragile the situation was. One wrong move, one sign of weakness, and the gang could react violently. Yet his confidence and careful calculation gave him an edge. Clara watched from the corner of the cabin. She could barely believe her eyes. A man standing outside, speaking to her captors with nothing but calm words and a strange confidence. She wondered if he could really be the one to save her, if the impossible might actually happen. In that moment, she felt a flicker of hope she hadn't felt in days. She had waited for rescue, but she had never imagined it would come in such an unusual form. A lone cowboy with $3 and a mind sharper than any weapon. The tension hung thick in the air as Jack continued to engage the gang, probing their weaknesses without threatening them. He noticed their pride, their greed, and their fear of getting caught. Slowly, he maneuvered them into a position where surrender seemed like a reasonable choice. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with their growing confusion. They argued among themselves, unsure whether to accept the strange offer or risk confrontation. Jack's quiet confidence was infectious, and even Clara felt a sense of relief as she realized that her chances of freedom were greater than she had dared hope. As evening settled, the light in the forest faded, casting long shadows across the ground. Jack remained outside, maintaining his position. He knew that patience was crucial. One false step could ruin everything. He watched the gang, noticed every twitch, every glance, every sign of hesitation. His mind calculated the best possible outcome: Clara safe, the gang restrained, and no bloodshed if possible. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move, and Clara, watching from inside, felt her heart rise with cautious hope. Jack had arrived not only with courage, but with strategy. He was not just a man with a horse and a gun. He was someone who understood human nature, who knew when to speak, when to wait, and when to act. Clara's fate, once so uncertain, now rested in the hands of someone who believed that bravery was measured not by strength, but by cleverness and timing. The night stretched on, and the quiet forest seemed to echo the tension inside the cabin. Both hope and fear mingled in the air, as if the world itself were waiting to see what would happen next. By the time the moon rose high, casting silver light over the cabin, Jack's presence had begun to change the energy of the place. The gang members, once confident, were now uneasy. Their earlier bravado was replaced by doubt, their arguments softened by the uncertainty that Jack had sown. Clara, for the first time in days, allowed herself to imagine freedom. She could almost feel the forest outside the cabin, the soft earth beneath her feet, the open sky above her head. And in the quiet strength of the lone cowboy outside, she found the possibility of hope, a hope that seemed almost impossible, yet undeniably real. Jack had been standing outside the cabin for some time, his eyes sharp, his posture calm, and his mind working faster than anyone could imagine. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and earth, but he paid it little mind. His attention was entirely on the small group of men inside the cabin. They were a reckless bunch, used to scaring others into submission, but Jack knew that they were not as clever as they thought. He had observed their habits, their weaknesses, and their fears, and now it was time to turn that knowledge into action. He took a deep breath and stepped closer to the cabin, letting his voice carry without shouting. "I'm here for the girl," he said calmly. Inside, the gang members froze, glancing at one another with sudden unease. They had expected someone, perhaps a sheriff or a brave family member, but certainly not a lone cowboy who spoke with such quiet confidence. Jack's calmness was unusual, and it made them nervous. There was no anger, no threat, just a quiet certainty that unnerved even the boldest among them. The tallest man, a hulking figure with rough hands and a scar across his cheek, stepped forward. "And what makes you think you can take her?" he demanded, his voice rough and filled with suspicion. "You're alone? We have guns, knives, and numbers on our side. What can you possibly do?" Jack looked at him steadily, his eyes unwavering. "I don't need more than what I have," he replied simply. Sometimes cleverness and courage are worth more than weapons and strength. The gang laughed at his words, but it was a hollow laughter. Even as they mocked him, they could feel the weight of his calmness. Jack didn't raise his voice, didn't make sudden moves, and didn't show fear. Instead, he let silence fill the space between them, a silence heavy with confidence. Clara, peeking through a small crack in the window, felt her heart lift slightly. There was something about this man, something different from anyone she had ever seen, that made her believe in the possibility of escape. Jack continued, carefully planting seeds of doubt. "I know what you want," he said slowly. "Money. But I have only $3 to offer. That's all I can give." The gang erupted in laughter, almost spitting at the idea. $3? They had imagined a ransom hundreds of times greater. To them, the offer was absurd, almost insulting. But Jack didn't flinch. He let the laughter die down naturally, letting it hang in the air like a question they couldn't answer. One of the smaller men inside the cabin shifted uneasily. He had not been part of this long, and the audacity of Jack's words unsettled him. $3, he muttered, glancing at the others. "That's ridiculous. Why would anyone come and offer that?" Jack's eyes flicked toward him briefly, just enough to let the man know that he had been noticed. "Because clever people find value where others see none," he replied. "Sometimes what seems small can accomplish more than what seems large." The conversation continued, each word carefully measured. Jack never raised his voice, never threatened, but he spoke with a confidence that made the gang members question themselves. They began to argue among themselves, their previous certainty replaced by uncertainty. Should they accept this strange offer? Should they risk conflict with a man who appeared calm and fearless? Even the tallest man felt the shift, the creeping doubt that Jack had intentionally planted. Inside the cabin, Clara watched everything with wide eyes. Her hope, once dimmed by days of captivity, began to flicker again. Could it really be possible that freedom might come for something as small as $3? She wanted to believe, but caution held her back. Still, Jack's calmness and clever words gave her courage. For the first time since her capture, she felt that her release might not be just a dream. Jack continued his careful negotiation. He spoke of risk and consequence, hinting that the gang's actions could bring trouble if they refused. "You know the law watches even the smallest of towns," he said softly, "and even the cleverest of men can make mistakes. Sometimes it is wiser to accept a smaller gain than to risk losing everything." His words were not threats, yet they carried weight. The gang members shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado fading under the quiet logic of the cowboy outside. As the minutes stretched on, Jack's strategy became clear. He appealed to their pride, their fear, and their greed, weaving each carefully into a single narrative that made surrender seem reasonable. He knew he could not force them physically, but he could lead them to a choice that seemed logical in their own minds. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance of power shifted from the gang to Jack. His calmness and insight became more powerful than any weapon they held. Clara felt her pulse quicken. She could see the confusion on their faces, the way they whispered among themselves, uncertain of what to do. For the first time, she allowed herself a small measure of hope. Perhaps she would walk out of this cabin alive, thanks to the cleverness of the man outside. She realized that courage was not only about fighting, but also about waiting for the right opportunity, about trusting someone who saw a way through danger where others saw none. Jack, sensing their growing uncertainty, pressed just enough to maintain control. $3 is all I can offer, he repeated. But it will be enough if you have sense. You will leave with something, and no one will be harmed. Refuse, and you risk everything you have. The gang's arguments grew louder, but they were arguments born of fear and indecision, not confidence. Jack's plan was working, and he remained steady, letting their confusion do the work for him. He noticed the smallest man fidgeting nervously, clearly the most unsure of the group. "You want to leave here without trouble?" Jack said, addressing him indirectly. "Accept what I offer, and it's simple. You walk away with your prize and no one is hurt. Refuse, and the outcome may not be so certain." His words were careful, balanced between warning and reassurance. The gang began to realize that the risk of confrontation with this calm, calculating man outweighed the small gain of defying him. Inside, Clara's breath caught. She had watched fear and courage battle in her captor's eyes, and now she saw the moment when reason began to win. Jack's strategy, his patience, and his understanding of human nature were slowly turning the impossible into reality. She felt a surge of relief mixed with awe. She had waited for rescue, but this was not a rescue born of brute force. It was born of intelligence, courage, and careful calculation. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the tallest man spoke again, his voice hesitant. $3? He said slowly. "Is that really all?" Jack nodded calmly. "Yes. But it is enough if you have sense. You will walk away with something and cause no harm. Refuse, and you risk everything." The gang members looked at one another, uncertainty written across their faces. The tension was almost unbearable, the air thick with the possibility of freedom or disaster. Clara realized that the moment of decision had arrived. How? Her heart pounded, and she whispered to herself, "Please, let this work. Please, let him be right." The gang, sensing the growing tension, finally reached a reluctant decision. With a mix of pride and fear, they agreed to accept the $3. Jack's clever negotiation had succeeded. He had turned fear, greed, and pride into a path for Clara's release, without lifting a weapon or showing anger. As the gang prepared to comply, Clara's hope blossomed into cautious joy. She could feel her heart lift, the promise of freedom growing real. Jack remained outside, watching carefully, ensuring that every step went smoothly. His calm presence was a shield, protecting Clara from the chaos of the gang's internal struggle. For her, the impossible had become possible, and the moment of her liberation was close at hand. Jack's patience, intelligence, and courage had transformed the situation completely. The gang, once confident in their control, had been outsmarted without the need for violence. Clara realized that her freedom depended not only on bravery, but also on cleverness, the ability to understand people, to read situations, and to act with precision. She marveled at the quiet hero outside the cabin, a man who had made a difference with nothing more than words, observation, and an unshakable calm. The first light of dawn crept slowly over the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. A soft mist hovered between the trees, making the world seem quiet and dreamlike. Inside the cabin, Clara sat very still, her eyes fixed on the small window, her heart beating faster than it had in days. She could sense that something was different today, a change in the air, a shift in the tension that had filled every moment of her captivity. The gang, once so confident and threatening, seemed unsettled, uncertain, and for the first time her mind dared to imagine freedom. Outside, Jack stood patiently, his calm presence a steady anchor in the midst of chaos. The cowboy's chestnut horse shifted gently beneath him, sensing the tension, and Jack adjusted his stance, ready for whatever might come next. He had spent hours negotiating, planting doubt and careful reasoning into the minds of the gang members. Now at last he could see that his words had taken root. The gang was hesitating, their earlier bravado replaced by nervous glances and whispered arguments. One wrong move could ruin everything, but Jack remained steady, his eyes never leaving the cabin. Inside, the tallest gang member scratched his head, his brow furrowed. $3? That's it? He asked again, as if saying it out loud might make the absurdity real. The others muttered among themselves, some angry, some uncertain, but all aware that Jack's calmness gave him a dangerous advantage. Their arguments grew weaker, their voices filled with doubt, and Clara could sense the shift even without seeing them. The fear she had carried in her chest for days began to ease, replaced with cautious hope. Jack's voice broke the silence once more, gentle but firm. $3 is all I offer. Take it, and no one is harmed. Refuse, and you risk everything you have. His words were simple, yet they carried weight beyond measure. He understood human nature, the mixture of pride, greed, and fear, and he used it like a key to unlock the door to freedom. The gang, realizing the cleverness of his words, finally nodded reluctantly. They would accept the offer. Clara felt her stomach tighten with nervous excitement. Could it really be happening? After days of fear and isolation, was her freedom finally within reach? She tried not to think too far ahead, not to hope too much, and yet the possibility of stepping outside, breathing fresh air, and feeling the forest under her feet made her heart ache with longing. She rose slowly, careful not to draw attention to herself, and positioned herself near the cabin door. Her hands trembled, but her spirit remained strong, ready for the moment that would change her life. Jack dismounted from his horse, approaching the cabin calmly. He held the $3 in his hand, letting them shine faintly in the early sunlight. The gang, still unsure of what to do, glanced at one another. Jack's calm demeanor, his quiet confidence, and the clever negotiation he had conducted all made their decision clear. They would release the young woman. The tallest man stepped aside, grumbling, while the others followed reluctantly, allowing the moment of freedom to unfold. Clara stepped forward, each movement deliberate, feeling the weight of every day she had spent trapped in the cabin. She pushed open the door slowly, almost afraid that the world outside might be different from what she remembered. But as the sunlight touched her face, warm and gentle, a smile broke across her lips. The air was fresh, filled with the sense of pine, earth, and life. She inhaled deeply, feeling it fill her lungs with hope and possibility. Freedom had never felt so sweet. Jack offered a small, reassuring nod, and Clara felt a surge of gratitude. She didn't fully understand how a lone cowboy and $3 had accomplished what seemed impossible, but she knew that her life had been changed forever. The gang watched silently, their faces a mix of resentment and relief, as Clara stepped further from the cabin, each step lighter than the last. The forest seemed to open up before her, a world of freedom she had almost forgotten existed. She paused for a moment, glancing back at the cabin. The walls that had held her prisoner now seemed smaller, weaker, almost insignificant compared to the courage she had carried within herself. Clara realized that her defiance, her refusal to surrender, had been just as important as Jack's cleverness. Together, their courage had brought about her release. She stepped fully into the sunlight, feeling the warmth on her face and the grass beneath her feet. It was a moment of pure, unshakable freedom. Jack stayed close, guiding her gently but without overbearing. He had no need to speak much. His calm presence was enough to reassure her. Clara looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and gratitude. I can't believe this, she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Jack smiled faintly, modestly. Sometimes courage and cleverness are enough, he said simply. And sometimes $3 can do what strength cannot. Clara laughed softly, the sound bright and free, a sound that had been missing for far too long. The gang, seeing their plan fail and their control vanish, began to retreat slowly. They muttered under their breath, but there was no fight left in them. Jack had outsmarted them, not with force, but with patience and intelligence. Clara felt a strange mix of relief and triumph. She had faced fear, endured isolation, and now she was free because someone had seen a way through danger that others had overlooked. It was a lesson she would carry with her forever. As they walked toward the edge of the forest, the morning light grew brighter, casting golden rays across the landscape. Clara felt every step, savoring the sensation of moving without chains, without threats, without fear pressing on her chest. Her heart swelled with gratitude, not only for her release, but for the realization that courage could take many forms. Jack had shown her that day that bravery was not only about fighting, it was also about thinking, observing, and acting with careful precision. The journey back to town was quiet but filled with a sense of triumph. Clara's mind replayed the events of the past days, the fear, the defiance, the careful observation, and finally, the clever negotiation. She understood now that her spirit, combined with Jack's intelligence, had created a path to freedom. The $3 had been symbolic, a simple gesture that carried the weight of strategy, courage, and hope. It was a reminder that sometimes the smallest actions could have the greatest impact. Clara looked around the forest, noticing details she had ignored before: the soft chirping of birds, the gentle sway of branches, the distant glimmer of sunlight on a stream. Everything seemed alive, vibrant, and full of possibility. For the first time in days, she felt truly connected to the world, no longer trapped in fear, but free to experience life fully. Her steps became lighter, her smile brighter, and her heart stronger with every passing moment. Jack led her through the final stretch of trees, guiding her back to the path that would take her to safety. Clara felt a mixture of relief and admiration for the man who had changed her fate with $3, and careful thought. She wanted to ask him questions, to understand how he had known exactly what to do, but she also realized that some things were best appreciated without words. His actions had spoken louder than any explanation could. By the time they reached the open fields near the town, Clara's fear had completely lifted. She could see the distant rooftops and the people going about their lives, unaware of the danger that had nearly taken her. She felt a surge of independence and resilience, knowing that she had survived not only because of Jack, but also because of her own courage and defiance. The world felt new, full of opportunity, and she was ready to step into it. Clara turned to Jack, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice filled with emotion. Jack nodded, humble and quiet. "Be safe," he replied. "And remember, Courage and cleverness can take you far, sometimes farther than strength or fear ever could. Clara smiled, understanding the truth in his words. With a final nod, Jack mounted his horse and rode off into the forest, leaving Clara standing in the sunlight, free at last. The cabin, the gang, the fear. Clara walked slowly through the town, her steps light and her heart filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. The streets, which had once seemed ordinary and mundane, now appeared vibrant and full of life. She noticed the small details she had never paid attention to before: the soft creak of doors opening, the chatter of children playing, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery. Everything felt new, as if the world itself had been waiting for her return to notice its beauty. She paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, and let the cool morning air fill her lungs. Freedom, after all she had endured, was more precious than she could have imagined. As she walked, the townspeople began to notice her. Whispers spread quickly through the streets. "She's back. Clara's free. Did you hear what happened?" People emerged from their homes, eyes wide with curiosity and relief. Clara's ordeal had become the talk of the town, and she could feel the mixture of admiration and concern from those around her. Some offered kind words, others asked endless questions, and a few stared silently, amazed at her survival. Clara smiled softly, grateful for the attention, but also aware of the weight her story now carried. Her mind replayed the events of the past days, the fear, the isolation, and finally, the clever intervention of the lone cowboy. She thought about how Jack had observed, calculated, and negotiated, with a quiet confidence that had unsettled her captors and ultimately freed her. It was almost unbelievable that such a small gesture, $3, combined with intelligence and courage, could achieve what seemed impossible. Clara realized that her life had changed forever, not only because she was free, but because she had witnessed the power of patience, cleverness, and quiet determination. Clara returned to her home, where her family waited anxiously, their faces filled with worry and hope. Her mother rushed forward, embracing her tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You're safe," she whispered repeatedly, holding Clara as if she would never let her go. Clara felt the warmth of home envelop her, a sense of belonging and security she had longed for during her captivity. She hugged her family back with all the strength she had, grateful for their love and support, and more determined than ever to live fully and bravely. In the days that followed, Clara became more reflective. She thought about the courage it had taken to survive, the patience she had maintained despite fear, and the cleverness of the cowboy who had changed her fate. She understood now that bravery was not always loud or violent. Sometimes it was quiet, strategic, and patient. Jack had shown her that intelligence and calm determination could accomplish what raw strength could not. Clara's respect for him grew with each thought, and she realized that the lessons she had learned would stay with her for the rest of her life. The townspeople continued to talk about the events, recounting every detail with fascination. Clara became both a symbol of resilience and a reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope could be found. She listened as people described how the cowboy had outsmarted the gang with nothing more than $3 and clever words. Some were skeptical, unable to believe such a small sum could make a difference. But Clara knew the truth. The money was not the key. The combination of courage, intelligence, and timing had been. She smiled quietly, knowing that the world was full of unexpected solutions if one was patient enough to see them. Clara also thought about the gang, now scattered and defeated, their confidence broken. They had underestimated her courage and the cleverness of the man who came to rescue her. She realized that cruelty and force could be challenged, and that even those who seemed powerful could be outsmarted. This understanding gave her a new sense of empowerment. She had faced fear directly and survived, not just through luck, but by holding on to her defiance, observing carefully and trusting in the possibility of rescue. It was a lesson she would carry forever. As she resumed her daily life, Clara found that her perspective on the world had changed. Simple things, a warm meal, the sound of laughter, the feeling of sunlight on her skin, seemed more meaningful. She approached each day with a renewed appreciation for life and the people around her. Her experience had taught her resilience, patience, and courage, and she found herself noticing the small acts of bravery in others, recognizing that heroism often came in subtle and unexpected forms. Clara also carried a sense of gratitude for Jack, the cowboy whose intelligence and courage had saved her life. She wondered about him often, imagining where he had gone and hoping that he was safe and well. She knew that she had been fortunate, and that sometimes the world offered help in ways that were unexpected but deeply transformative. Jack had reminded her that courage, cleverness, and timing could create miracles, and Clara felt inspired to live her life with that same quiet strength. In the weeks that followed, Clara began to share her story more openly. She spoke to neighbors, friends, and even travelers passing through the town, recounting not only the fear she had faced, but also the hope and cleverness that had led to her release. People listened with rapt attention, inspired by her courage and fascinated by the clever negotiation that had freed her. Clara emphasized that survival often required both inner strength and a willingness to trust in the unexpected. Her words became a source of guidance and inspiration for those who faced challenges of their own. She also reflected on the lessons of human nature she had learned during her captivity. She had seen fear, greed, pride, and doubt play out in real time, and she understood how these emotions could be both dangerous and predictable. Jack had used this understanding to his advantage, and Clara recognized that observing and understanding people could be as powerful as any weapon. This insight made her more confident in her interactions with others and gave her a sense of agency she had never felt before. As the town returned to its usual rhythm, Clara felt a quiet pride in her own resilience. She had survived not just through rescue, but through her own strength of mind and spirit. The memory of confinement, fear, and uncertainty remained with her, but it no longer controlled her. Instead, it became a reminder of her capacity to endure, to observe, and to act wisely in the face of danger. She knew that life would continue to present challenges, but she felt ready to meet them with the courage and intelligence she had discovered in herself. The story of Clara's captivity and release became a part of the town's history, recounted for years as a tale of courage, cleverness, and hope. Parents told it to their children not only as a thrilling adventure but also as a lesson that strength was not always measured in size or weapons, and that even small actions, guided by intelligence and timing, could achieve great outcomes. Clara listened to these retellings with humility, knowing that while the story was inspiring, it was also a reminder of the fragile balance between fear and courage, danger and opportunity. In quiet moments, Clara would think back to the forest, the cabin, and the lone cowboy who had made the impossible possible. She realized that the experience had changed her profoundly, giving her a deeper understanding of human nature, resilience, and the power of hope. She had been tested in ways she never imagined, and she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more aware of her own capabilities. The $3 that had secured her freedom were symbolic, a reminder that cleverness, courage, and careful action could outmatch brute force and fear. Clara's life gradually returned to normal, but she carried with her a sense of awareness and gratitude that colored everything she did. She valued freedom more deeply, appreciated the small joys of life, and approached challenges with patience and careful thought. The story of her captivity and release became not only a memory, but also a guide for living with courage, intelligence, and hope. She understood now that even in the darkest moments, there was the possibility of light, and that resilience and cleverness could change the course of one's life forever. And so Clara lived on, carrying the lessons of fear, courage, and cleverness with her. She remembered the cabin, the gang, and the lone cowboy, and she understood that life often provided help in unexpected ways. She faced the world with newfound strength, ready to embrace each day fully, and inspired by the knowledge that bravery and intelligence, even in small measures, could create miracles. Her story became a lasting testament to hope, resilience, and the extraordinary power of human spirit, and the darkness of the past days now felt distant. Clara felt stronger, wiser, and more aware of the value of patience, courage, and hope. She had faced what seemed impossible, and through her own spirit and the clever intervention of a stranger, she had triumphed. As she walked toward the town, the warmth of the morning sun on her face and the soft breeze through the trees, she knew that this day would remain in her memory forever. A day when freedom had been won, not by force, but by courage, intelligence, and a little bit of luck.